The heretic's fork. In the late 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition sought to purify the faith through methods designed not to kill quickly, but to break the mind and spirit first. Among their tools was the heretic's fork, a deceptively simple device that inflicted continuous agony without drawing blood. It consisted of two double-pronged forks attached to a leather strap, one set of sharp prongs pressed upward beneath the chin, while the other pressed downward against the breastbone. The strap fastened tightly around the neck, making removal impossible. A man accused of blasphemy was brought before the inquisitors in a stone chamber lit by torches. His crime was speaking against church doctrine in a public square. The interrogators fitted the device around his neck, adjusting the leather until the four prongs bit into flesh. The metal points did not pierce deeply, but pressed with enough force to prevent any movement of the head. Within the first hour, his neck muscles began to cramp. He could not lower his chin to rest. He could not raise his head to relieve the pressure. Any attempt to speak drove the lower prongs deeper into his chest. Swallowing became painful, then impossible. Saliva pooled in his mouth with nowhere to go. By the second day, he had not slept. Every time exhaustion pulled his head downward, the prongs stabbed harder, jolting him awake. His legs trembled from standing in one position. The muscles in his neck spasmed uncontrollably. Delirium crept in. He tried to scream but could only produce a wet gurgle as the prongs punctured the soft tissue beneath his tongue. On the third day, infection set in. The four puncture wounds turned red, then began to weep pus. Fever consumed him. His body shook violently, but the fork held his head rigid. The inquisitors watched him convulse, waiting for a confession that his ruined throat could no longer speak. He died on the fourth day, not from the wounds themselves, but from sepsis that spread from the infected punctures into his bloodstream. His body remained standing, held upright by the device until someone finally cut the strap. Scaphism. In 401 BC, King Artaxerxes II of Persia ordered a punishment so horrific it became legendary even in an era accustomed to brutality. The victim was Mithridates, a soldier who had killed the king's brother Cyrus during battle. Rather than grant him a swift execution befitting a warrior, Artaxerxes commanded he suffer scaphism, a method designed to prolong death beyond what seemed humanly possible. Scaphism was rarely used even by Persian standards, reserved for only the most hated enemies of the empire. The execution began with Mithridates being stripped naked. Guards bound him securely between two hollowed-out wooden boats of equal size, forming a shell around his body. His head, arms, and legs protruded from holes cut precisely for this purpose. The boats were then sealed together with metal clasps, creating a tight enclosure around his torso. Once secured, executioners force-fed him a mixture of milk and honey until his stomach distended painfully. The same sticky substance was then smeared liberally over his exposed face, hands, and feet. He was placed in a stagnant marsh under the burning Persian sun. Within hours, the mixture on his skin began attracting insects. Flies landed on his face, crawling into his nose, ears, and mouth. He could feel them walking across his eyes. The milk and honey caused violent diarrhea, but unable to move, the waste collected inside the wooden chamber around his body. The fetid matter quickly became a breeding ground for maggots and more flies. By the second day, insects had begun laying eggs in his ears, nostrils, and excrement-soaked wooden tomb. Mithridates remained conscious as his body became a living ecosystem of parasites. His exposed skin, now sunburned and swollen, provided entry points for burrowing insects. Guards continued force-feeding him daily, ensuring he would not die of dehydration or starvation. His lucidity extended his horror. He could feel creatures moving beneath his skin, consuming him from the inside out. Mithridates survived for 17 days before his body finally surrendered. Execution by elephant. In 1305, the Sultan of Delhi, Alauddin Khalji, ordered a public execution that would demonstrate his absolute power. The condemned was a tax collector accused of embezzling from the royal treasury. Execution by elephant was reserved for crimes against the state, a spectacle designed not just to kill but to terrify any who witnessed it. In South and Southeast Asia, these massive animals were seen as extensions of royal authority, instruments of a ruler's will rather than mere beasts. The execution required careful preparation. For weeks before the scheduled death, a specially trained elephant was kept from food and agitated by its handlers. The animal, a male bull in musth, a state of heightened aggression, stood nearly 10 feet tall at the shoulder. Its tusks had been fitted with sharp metal caps designed to pierce human flesh. The creature had been trained through a precise system of rewards to respond to specific commands from its mahout, or handler, who would direct each movement during the execution. On the appointed day, thousands gathered in the public square. The condemned man was brought forward, his hands bound behind his back. He was forced to kneel in the center of the square as the elephant was led in. Witnesses later described the man's terror as he heard the elephant's footsteps approaching from behind, each impact shaking the ground. The mahout gave the first command. The elephant wrapped its trunk around the man's torso, lifting him 6 feet into the air. The crowd fell silent. The mahout's second command came. The elephant did not kill immediately. Instead, it placed one massive foot on the man's leg and slowly applied pressure. Bones cracked audibly. The condemned screamed as his leg was crushed to pulp. The elephant methodically moved to each limb, crushing them one by one while the victim remained conscious, his body producing enough adrenaline adrenaline to keep him awake through unimaginable pain. Only after all 4 limbs were destroyed did the mahout signal for the final command. The elephant positioned its foot over the man's head and pressed down. The rack. In 1534, William Tyndale was imprisoned in the Tower of London. His crime was translating the Bible into English, considered heresy by the Catholic Church. While imprisonment itself was brutal, it was the repeated sessions on the rack that made Tyndale's experience a descent into calculated suffering. The rack was not designed to kill outright, but to break both body and spirit through methodical application of pain beyond human tolerance. It was England's premier instrument of torture during the Tudor period. The device itself was deceptively simple, a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at each end. Guards stripped Tyndale and laid him on his back on the wooden bed. His wrists were secured to one roller, his ankles to the other, using heavy rope or iron shackles that bit into the flesh. The torturer, an experienced man who knew precisely how far a body could be stretched before fatal damage occurred, stood ready at the handle that controlled the mechanism. With each turn of the handle, the rollers rotated in opposite directions, increasing the tension on the victim's body. The first turns produced immediate pain as joints were stretched to their natural limits. Tyndale would have felt his shoulders and hips burn with resistance. The torturer paused, asking for confession. When none came, he turned the handle again. The popping sound that followed was Tyndale's shoulders dislocating. His screams echoed through the stone chamber. Each subsequent turn separated more joints, elbows, knees, then individual finger and toe joints tearing apart. The most excruciating aspect was not just the pain, but Tyndale's complete helplessness as his body was systematically destroyed. Blood vessels burst beneath his skin, creating spreading bruises. Ligaments tore away from bone. The torturer knew exactly how to keep him conscious, occasionally throwing cold water on his face when shock threatened to provide relief through unconsciousness. Between sessions, physicians attended to him, not out of mercy, but to ensure he survived for the next round. For nearly a year, Tyndale endured repeated racking, his body never healing from one session before the next began. His arms remained permanently stretched, several inches longer than natural. Boiling alive. On April 5, 1532, Richard Rose faced the crowd at Smithfield in London. Rose, a cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher, had been accused of poisoning the porridge served in the bishop's kitchen, killing 2 people. King Henry VIII was so outraged that he personally intervened, passing a special act of parliament declaring poisoning a form of high treason and prescribing boiling alive as its punishment. Rose would be the first to suffer this newly codified torture, a spectacle designed to demonstrate the crown's power. The execution platform had been prepared with methodical care. At its center stood a massive cauldron, large enough to contain a man, filled with water and mounted over a roaring fire. The flames had been burning since dawn, bringing the water to a vigorous boil. Steam rose in clouds, visible to the thousands who had gathered. Rose was led up the steps to the platform, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Guards stripped him naked, exposing him to the jeers of the crowd. The executioner checked the temperature of the liquid with a long wooden pole, nodding to indicate readiness. 4 strong men seized Rose by his arms and legs. As they lifted him, he began struggling violently, suddenly comprehending the full horror of what awaited. The men swung him 3 times to build momentum, then released him feet first into the boiling water. The initial shock sent water splashing over the cauldron's rim, sizzling as it hit the flames below. Rose's legs entered first, the scalding liquid instantly blistering his skin. He screamed with such force that witnesses later claimed they could hear him clearly despite the roar of the crowd. His lower extremities were instantly cooked, the skin sloughing off in sheets to expose raw flesh beneath. Blood vessels burst instantly, creating a crimson tinge in the water. The extreme temperature caused fat beneath the skin to melt and float to the surface. Guards used poles to force him deeper into the cauldron. His internal organs began to cook while his brain remained horrifyingly alert, processing each moment of agony until shock finally rendered him unconscious. The entire process took nearly 15 minutes, with Rose conscious for most of it. His last words, recorded by a witness, were desperate pleas for someone to pull him out and grant him a quicker death. The breaking wheel. In 1348, during the height of the Black Death, Jacques Fournier was dragged to the town square of Avignon, France. Accused of spreading plague by poisoning wells, Fournier faced execution on the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine Wheel after the martyrdom of St. Catherine. As hysteria over the plague intensified, authorities sought spectacular punishments to appease public fear. The wheel was selected not just to kill but to destroy the body so methodically that it would serve as the ultimate warning to others. The wheel itself was a massive wooden cartwheel, 5 feet in diameter, with heavy wooden spokes radiating from its center. Workers secured it horizontally atop a sturdy wooden scaffold. Fournier was stripped naked and spread at eagle to cross the wheel. Using thick ropes, executioners bound his arms and legs to the wheel's rim, stretching him into an X shape that exposed the joints and long bones of his limbs. The punishment began with methodical precision. The executioner, a man known for his strength, approached with an iron rod as thick as a man's wrist. He first struck Fournier's right shin between 2 gaps in the supporting frame. The blow shattered both bones with an audible crack. Fournier screamed screamed, his body instinctively trying to curl protectively, but held firm by the bindings. The executioner proceeded systematically, left shin, right forearm, left forearm, allowing several minutes between each strike so the victim would fully experience each new agony before the next began. After breaking the major limbs, the executioner targeted joints, elbows, shoulders, knees, ankles. Each precise blow dislocated and crushed the joint completely. Despite catastrophic injuries, Fournier remained conscious, his nervous system overwhelmed by signals it could not process. Blood pooled beneath the wheel as broken bone fragments pierced through muscle and skin. By tradition, the final mercy was to deliver crushing blows to the chest and abdomen, rupturing vital organs. This coup de grace was deliberately withheld. Instead, the wheel with Fournier still bound to it was hoisted onto a pole in the town square. He survived for 3 more days, exposed to the elements, before death finally came. Lingchi. On April 10, 1905, Wang Wei-qin faced his execution in Beijing, China. He had been convicted of murdering an entire family, a crime deemed so heinous that ordinary execution was considered insufficient punishment. The Qing dynasty court sentenced him to Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, one of the last such executions before the practice was officially abolished later that same year. Lingchi was reserved for only the most severe crimes: treason, patricide, or mass murder. It was not merely execution, but the systematic destruction of the body, an act believed to deny the victim proper reincarnation. The execution ground had been prepared before dawn. A wooden frame shaped like a cross stood in the center of a courtyard, surrounded by a crowd of officials and curious onlookers. Wang was brought forward, stripped to the waist, and secured to the frame with leather straps at his wrists, ankles, and torso. The bindings were tight enough to prevent movement, but positioned to allow access to all parts of his body. The executioner approached, carrying a sharp, thin-bladed knife designed specifically for Lingchi. This blade was kept razor-sharp, allowing it to slice through skin and muscle with minimal resistance. The procedure followed a prescribed ritual. The executioner began with the peripheral areas of the body, the thighs and outer chest. With surgical precision, he removed small strips of flesh approximately 1 inch wide. Each cut was deliberate, shallow enough to avoid severing major blood vessels that might hasten death. Wang's screams echoed across the courtyard as the first cuts exposed raw tissue to the open air. Officials stood nearby, consulting a scroll that dictated the exact sequence of cuts. The most horrific aspect of Lingchi was not just the pain but the awareness. Wang remained fully conscious as his body was systematically dismembered. The executioner worked methodically toward more sensitive areas: inner thighs, chest, face. Between cuts, attendants applied hot cloths to the wounds, both to stem bleeding and to intensify pain through cauterization. The process was deliberately extended, designed to last for hours. Wang's consciousness was maintained through periodic splashes of cold water to his face. After approximately 300 cuts, the executioner finally delivered the mercy stroke, a knife thrust directly to the heart, ending Wang's torment after nearly 2 hours of systematic mutilation. Rat torture. In 1542, Johann Diaz was imprisoned in the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition. Accused of heresy for possessing Protestant texts, he had already endured weeks of conventional questioning. When standard methods failed to extract a confession, the inquisitors turned to more creative means of persuasion. Rat torture was rarely documented in official records, but was whispered about among prisoners as the most terrifying fate that could befall those who refused to confess. Unlike many tortures designed for public spectacle, this method was employed in the isolated depths of dungeons where screams would echo unheard. The torture chamber was prepared with clinical efficiency. Guards stripped Diaz and secured him to a heavy wooden table with iron restraints at his wrists, ankles, and neck. The restraints were tightened until they cut into his flesh, ensuring he could not move even a fraction of an inch. His abdomen was exposed, pale skin stretched taut over his ribcage. The torturer approached carrying a metal container resembling a bucket with one open end. Inside, Diaz could hear frantic scratching. A large rat captured from the sewer system beneath the prison and deliberately starved for 3 days. The torturer placed the open end of the container directly on Diaz's bare stomach. The rat immediately began scratching at the soft flesh, its claws leaving thin red welts. A servant brought forward a brazier of glowing coals and placed it atop the closed end of the metal container. As the metal heated, the rat grew increasingly frantic. The animal had only one escape route, through Diaz's body. He felt the creature's first desperate bite tear through his skin. Blood welled around the rat's snout as it chewed more aggressively, driven mad by the intensifying heat above. Diaz remained conscious as the rat burrowed deeper. The animal's instinct for survival overcame any obstacle, gnawing through muscle tissue and eventually reaching the peritoneal cavity. The inquisitors watched impassively as Diaz's screams transformed into gurgles. The rat continued its desperate journey, tearing through internal organs in its panic attempt to escape the heat. The pain was beyond description, not a single overwhelming shock, but a moving epicenter of agony that traveled through his body as the creature tunneled deeper. After 40 minutes of this progressive horror, the rat reached Diaz's diaphragm, finally causing enough damage to vital systems that his body could no longer maintain consciousness. He died from catastrophic internal bleeding shortly thereafter. Judas cradle. The Judas cradle emerged in the dark prisons of medieval Europe as both a punishment and interrogation device. Prison wardens favored its reliability and the way it broke both the body and will. The device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat with a pointed tip, mounted on a wooden stool or frame. Its name invoked the betrayer of Christ, suggesting this was the fate reserved for those who turned against authority. In 15th century Spain, it became the preferred method for extracting confessions from those accused of heresy or treason. The condemned would first be stripped naked, exposing them to both the elements and humiliation. Guards would bind their hands above their head or behind their back, making it impossible to brace against what was coming. The victim was then positioned directly above the pointed tip of the pyramid. Initially, the sharp end would press against their most sensitive regions without breaking the skin. This moment of anticipation was often when the first confessions were offered. For those who remained silent, the true torment began. Guards would slowly lower the prisoner, allowing their body weight to press against the point. The pyramid's tip was designed to penetrate, but not kill quickly. With each passing minute, the pressure increased. Some victims were lowered manually, while others had weights attached to their ankles, dragging them down with inexorable force. The tip would eventually pierce the flesh, creating a wound that widened as the body descended further. Blood loss weakened the victim, while the open wound invited infection. Fever would set in within days. Throughout the process, interrogators would return, offering relief in exchange for information or confession. Many broke psychologically before significant physical damage occurred. Those who endured faced a slow death from blood loss, infection, or the gradual tearing of internal organs as the pyramid worked deeper into their body with each involuntary movement. Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey earned its grim reputation during the Inquisition. Though records show versions appeared earlier across medieval Europe, public officials named it for its vague resemblance to the back of a donkey, though victims found nothing familiar about its agonizing edge. The device consisted of a narrow wooden beam positioned vertically, like an inverted triangle, with the sharpened edge pointing upward. Unlike other instruments concealed in dungeon chambers, the Spanish donkey often stood in town squares, where the punishment served as both retribution and warning. Prisoners were stripped of clothing and forced to straddle the triangular beam, their legs dangling down either side. Guards positioned the edge precisely at the perineum, where even the slightest pressure caused immediate pain. Initial discomfort quickly transformed into something more sinister. Heavy iron weights were attached to the victim's ankles, starting with 10 pounds on each side. The weight pulled downward, forcing the sharp edge against delicate tissue. Every 15 minutes, officials would add more weight. 20 pounds became 40, then 60. The prisoner's body had nowhere to go except downward. The wooden edge, sometimes enhanced with metal, began its slow invasion of flesh. Onlookers gathered to witness the spectacle, their presence adding humiliation to physical suffering. Some victims lasted only hours before the edge split skin and began slicing through muscle and tissue. Blood ran down the sides of the wooden triangle, staining it darker with each new prisoner. The officials kept precise records of weights and time intervals. Those who confessed early might be spared the full procedure. The unlucky ones endured until the edge carved completely through their bodies, causing massive blood loss and shock. Some lost consciousness from pain before the final moments. Others remained terrifyingly aware as their bodies were literally split by the relentless pressure, the sound of tearing flesh audible to the gathered crowd as internal organs became external and life drained away. Pear of anguish. The pear of anguish first appeared in European interrogation chambers during the 1600s. Unlike many devices whose use is well documented, the pear exists in a shadow of historical uncertainty. Some scholars argue it was merely a threat, while others point to detailed illustrations in Inquisition manuals. The device itself was deceptively elegant, a metal bulb roughly the size of a fist with 4 petals that expanded outward when a screw mechanism was turned. Museum examples show meticulous craftsmanship, with precisely fitted springs and smooth tapered surfaces that belied their purpose. Inquisitors designed different variations for specific body cavities. The oral version was most common, reserved for heretics and blasphemers. The victim would be restrained, often in a seated position with head tilted backward. The closed pear would be inserted into the mouth. In its collapsed state, the device appeared manageable. False hope often lasted seconds. With the first turn of the screw, the petals would separate slightly. Each quarter turn widened them further, a mechanical blooming that forced the jaws apart. As the interrogator continued turning, pressure against teeth became unbearable. Molars cracked under forces they were never designed to withstand. The expanding metal stretched the corners of the mouth until splitting began. Victims could produce only unintelligible sounds as their ability to speak disappeared with each twist. Blood from torn gums and fractured teeth ran down their chin and neck. The pear's expansion was methodical, measured in precise increments. For those who refused to confess, the device would reach its maximum diameter, approximately 4 inches when fully deployed. Facial bones fractured under the pressure. the palate could split. Breathing became labored through a nose now bearing the mouth's burden. Some victims suffocated as blood and tissue blocked airways. Others survived with permanent disfigurement, their confession finally extracted along with portions of their jaw, the pear's petals painted red when finally withdrawn from what had once been a human face. Scavenger's Daughter. The Scavenger's Daughter first appeared in the Tower of London during the reign of Henry VIII. Created by Lieutenant Leonard Skeffington in 1531, the device was designed as the opposite of the rack. While the rack pulled limbs apart, the Scavenger's Daughter forced the body to collapse inward upon itself. The apparatus consisted of an iron frame with hinges and bars that could be tightened with screws. Its official purpose was to extract confessions from prisoners considered enemies of the crown. The device gained notoriety during the religious persecutions of Tudor England. The process began with the prisoner forced to kneel. Guards would fit the iron frame around the body, positioning metal bands across the back, under the thighs, and behind the neck. Initially, the prisoner would feel only the cold metal against skin. The interrogator would ask questions, offering freedom from the device in exchange for information. For those who refused to speak, the methodical compression began. The screw mechanism was turned slowly, bringing the metal bands closer together. As the device tightened, the prisoner's knees were forced upward toward the chest while the head was simultaneously pushed downward. The natural curve of the spine was forced to bend beyond its limits. Within minutes, muscles began to cramp from the unnatural position. The prisoner's breathing became shallow and labored as the ribcage compressed against the lungs. Sweat covered the skin as the body fought against its metal cage. The compression continued inexorably. After 1 hour, blood would begin seeping from the nose as internal pressure built. After 2, ears would leak crimson drops. The screw mechanism allowed precise control, keeping victims alive but in unspeakable agony. When turned to its final position, the body folded almost completely, compressing organs until they failed. Lungs collapsed first, making each breath shallower than the last. Ribs splintered under pressure, sending bone fragments into soft tissue. The heart, unable to expand properly, fluttered and stopped. Death came as the ultimate mercy, the body crushed into a fraction of its natural size. Peine forte et dure. The peine forte et dure emerged in medieval English courts as a solution to a legal paradox. The phrase translates to hard and forceful punishment, but this clinical term masked a calculated brutality. Under English common law, a defendant who refused to enter a plea could not be tried. Some remained silent to prevent their property from being seized after conviction. The courts developed peine forte et dure not as punishment for a crime, but as coercion to participate in the legal process. The practice continued into the 1700s, with precise protocols documented in court records. The process began with the accused stripped naked and placed on their back on the cold stone floor of a dungeon or cell. Their arms and legs were stretched outward and secured with rope or chain to metal rings embedded in the ground. A wooden board was positioned over their body, covering them from shoulders to ankles. The first day, they received no food. The second, a small piece of barley bread. The third, a drink of stagnant water from the nearest puddle or ditch. On the fourth day, the weights began. Court officials placed a single stone on the wooden board directly above the chest. Each stone weighed approximately 20 pounds. Every few hours, another stone was added. The pressure built gradually, making each weight breath more difficult than the last. The sternum bent inward with audible creaking. Ribs flexed beyond their limits. The prisoner faced a choice: enter a plea or endure more weight. Some lasted hours, others days. The most famous case was Giles Corey, accused of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. As stones piled on his chest, crushing his 81-year-old body, witnesses reported he spoke only twice, first to request more weight, hastening his own end. Then, as his chest cavity began to collapse and organs compressed, he gasped his final words through blood-flecked lips: more weight. His heart stopped after 2 days, the stone still in place as his body surrendered to the immovable pressure. Heretic's Fork. The heretic's fork first appeared in the interrogation chambers of the Spanish Inquisition during the 1400s. Despite its simple design, inquisitors considered it among their most effective tools. The device consisted of a 2-pronged metal fork, each end sharpened to a needle-like point. One prong was positioned under the chin, while the other pressed against the sternum. A leather strap around the neck held the fork in place, creating constant tension between the 2 points. Primarily used against those accused of blasphemy or heresy, the fork prevented speech without causing immediate death. The application began with the prisoner seated on a backless stool. The inquisitor would place the lower prong against the soft tissue under the chin, carefully positioning the upper prong against the breastbone. The strap would be secured tightly around the neck, creating immediate discomfort. The initial pain was minimal, just 2 points of pressure. The true torment lay in what came next. The prisoner could neither lower their chin without puncturing the skin beneath it, nor raise their head without the upper prong piercing their chest. Hours passed in perfect stillness. Any movement, even the slight nod of drowsiness, drove the prongs deeper. Blood trickled in thin rivulets down the neck and chest. After 6 hours, muscle fatigue became unbearable. The neck trembled from the strain of maintaining one position. After 12, hallucinations often began as sleep deprivation took hold. The mind registered every millimeter of movement with fresh pain. Some prisoners were kept in this position for days. The fork rarely killed directly, but its psychological impact was profound. The constant, unrelenting vigilance required to avoid self-injury drove many to mental collapse. Those who succumbed to exhaustion would slump forward, driving both prongs deep into flesh. The resulting wounds became infected in the filthy conditions of medieval prisons. Sepsis claimed those who survived the initial ordeal, their bodies finally surrendering to a slow, delirious death after days of perfect, agonizing wakefulness. Mazzatello. The Mazzatello was an official method of game-overing criminals in the Papal States from the 1600s until 1870. The term translates literally to little mallet, though the implement was anything but small. The procedure combined religious ceremony with brutal efficiency in a public spectacle that drew thousands of spectators. Unlike other European methods that emphasized slow suffering, the Mazzatello was designed as a relatively quick process, though this offered little comfort to those who experienced its crushing impact. The method was reserved for the most severe crimes against the church and state. The condemned would be led through the streets of Rome to a scaffold erected in a public square. Priests walked alongside, offering final prayers and opportunities for confession. Upon reaching the platform, the prisoner would kneel, facing away from the crowd, sometimes blindfolded. A wooden block was positioned before them, but unlike typical beheadings, they would not place their head upon it. Instead, they remained kneeling upright, their final moments spent in prayer or silent contemplation. The executioner would approach from behind wearing a black hood that concealed his identity. In his hands, he carried the Mazzatello, a wooden mallet with a heavy metal head, weighing approximately 15 pounds. The crowd would fall silent as he took position. With practiced precision, the executioner would swing the mallet in a single, powerful arc, striking the back of the condemned's skull with tremendous force. The impact shattered bone and caused immediate unconsciousness. The blow itself was rarely the direct cause of death. The unconscious body would collapse forward onto the block, still alive but completely unaware. Within seconds, the executioner would draw a knife and cut deeply across the throat, severing the carotid arteries and jugular vein. Blood poured forth in rhythmic pulses as the heart continued beating briefly, pumping life onto the wooden platform. Death followed within moments, the ceremonial mallet and knife combining religious symbolism with lethal efficiency in a ritual that transformed criminal punishment into sacred theater. Scold's bridle. The scold's bridle first appeared in Britain during the 1600s as a punishment exclusively for women. Local magistrates used it to silence those they deemed troublesome, women who argued, gossiped, or spoke against authority figures. The device was also called the branks, or gossip's bridle, names that reduced serious punishment to something almost comical. In reality, the bridle was a sophisticated instrument of pain and humiliation. Court records from the period show over 400 documented cases in England alone, with similar devices used across Scotland and parts of Germany. The bridle consisted of a metal cage that enclosed the entire head, with particular attention to the mouth. A plate extended inward, pressing down on the tongue. Most designs featured a spike between 1 and 2 inches long that rested directly on the tongue's surface. The entire apparatus locked at the back of the neck, preventing removal without a key. Application was public, often in the town square. The woman would be held still while the device was fitted, the mouthpiece inserted last. The initial pain was sharp and immediate as the spike pressed into the tongue's sensitive tissues. Any movement, any attempt to shift the position, drove the spike deeper. Instinctively, the woman would try to pull her tongue back, but the plate's design prevented this. Speaking became impossible. Even swallowing required careful concentration to avoid further injury. Once secured, the woman was led through town on a leash, often by her husband or a town official. The procession could last hours, sometimes an entire day. Saliva would build up without the ability to swallow normally, running down the chin and neck. The tongue swelled around the spike, increasing the pain with each passing hour. Thirst became unbearable, but drinking was impossible. By the time the bridle was removed, the tongue was often permanently damaged, bearing a wound that would become infected in an era before antibiotics. Some women lost portions of their tongue to gangrene. Others developed infections that spread to the throat, causing death by slow suffocation days after the punishment officially ended. Prehistoric era. Exile sounds almost gentle until you think about what it actually meant. In a world without agriculture, without permanent shelter, and without any way to store food long term, being cast out of your tribe was not a symbolic punishment. It was a carefully arranged death. Anthropologists studying prehistoric burial sites, including evidence from locations like Atapuerca in Spain, have found remains that suggest deliberate exclusion from communal graves, indicating that some individuals were rejected not just in life but in death. The exile person lost everything simultaneously: fire, protection, protection, food sharing, and the social identity that made survival possible. Wolves, exposure, and starvation would finish the job the tribe started. What makes this the defining punishment of the prehistoric era is the psychological architecture of it. Everyone watching understood exactly what was happening and chose not to stop it. The condemned did not die quickly. They wandered, probably for days, knowing the people who raised them had decided they no longer existed. Ancient Mesopotamia. The Assyrians did not just kill their enemies, they documented it on their walls. Carved palace reliefs from Nineveh, dating to the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, depict flaying in precise detail, executioners removing skin from living victims with practiced, almost methodical movements. Flaying works slowly because skin does not contain major blood vessels, meaning the victim stays alive and conscious while their bodies peeled apart. The skin was then displayed on city walls as a message to anyone approaching. This was not an emergency measure or a rare outrage. It was standard military communication. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE, already reflected a Mesopotamian legal culture, comfortable with extreme physical punishment as a public institution. Burning alive and impalement also appear in the records, but flaying had a particular quality that separated it. It turned a human being into a trophy. Ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians feared the second death more than the first. Physical death was manageable. The whole civilization was built around surviving it. What was truly unbearable was the erasure of your existence entirely. Your name chiseled off every surface. Your image gouged from every wall. Your tomb stripped of its purpose. Without your name, your soul could not be called back. Without your image, you could not be recognized in the afterlife. You simply stopped having ever existed. This punishment, applied most famously to Pharaoh Akhenaten after his reign ended in the 14th century BCE, was not impulsive. It was systematic and thorough, carried out by workers who went surface by surface across temples and monuments. For crimes like tomb robbery, the physical punishments were brutal enough. Records from Deir el-Medina document mutilation of the nose and ears, but those left a body behind. The erasure left nothing. Ancient Greece. Most people know about hemlock, the relatively peaceful execution Socrates reportedly accepted in 399 BCE. What they know less about is apotympanismos, the punishment reserved for those considered too dangerous or disgraceful for a clean death. The condemned was bound to a wooden plank, sometimes described as a board, sometimes a post, and left in public to die of exposure, thirst, and starvation over the course of days. There was no fixed timeline. No executioner came to end it. Passers-by were expected to observe and continue walking. The exposure element was deliberate. The body was on display throughout, alive and then not, serving as a continuous public message. Reserved for sacrilege and high treason, apotympanismos was distinct from execution in one specific way. The state did not kill you. It simply stopped acknowledging your right to be kept alive and then waited. Ancient Rome. Roman execution was designed to be watched, and damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to wild animals, was the format that most completely merged punishment with entertainment. Practiced from roughly the 2nd century BCE and formalized in venues like the Colosseum, it placed condemned prisoners, slaves, and early Christians into the arena with lions, bears, leopards, and bulls. Sometimes victims were tied to stakes. Sometimes they were given minimal weapons to extend the spectacle. The philosopher Seneca, who witnessed the games firsthand, wrote with unease about their effect on the crowd, describing how the audience became gradually desensitized to the violence until each death demanded something worse than the last. The punishment had no fixed duration and no guaranteed outcome. Animals did not always kill quickly, and the crowd's reaction influenced how long the process continued. It was not just an execution. It was a performance where the victim had no role except to suffer visibly. Early medieval Europe. The blood eagle appears in Norse sagas, including the Orkneyinga saga and Norna Gest's Thatter, described as the execution method used on figures like King Ella of Northumbria around 867 CE, allegedly in revenge for the death of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The method, as written, involved cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back, spreading them like wings. Whether this was a real practice or a literary construction is a question historians genuinely disagree on. Some argue the saga descriptions are too consistent to be entirely invented, while others contend the accounts are poetic exaggeration designed to amplify Viking ferocity in the written record. What is not disputed is the cultural function it served in the stories. The blood eagle was not random cruelty, but a ritual act, the highest possible insult delivered to the highest possible enemy. If it happened at all, it was reserved for kings. Medieval Islamic world. Among the more disturbing execution methods documented in medieval court records is death by enclosure in a freshly killed animal hide. The condemned was sewn tightly inside the hide while it was still warm and wet, then left in the open sun. As the hide dried over the following hours, it contracted, tightening slowly and uniformly around the body. The compression increased gradually, not in a single crushing blow, but in a sustained, unrelenting squeeze that took most of a day to complete. The method was reportedly favored in certain royal contexts, specifically because it did not involve visible bloodshed, preserving a technical innocence for the ruler who ordered it. Documented instances are difficult to verify across the broad geography of the medieval Islamic world, as practices varied significantly by region and dynasty, and some accounts may reflect political propaganda rather than confirmed history. But the core method appears in multiple independent sources from the period. Medieval Europe. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was the official punishment for high treason in medieval England, and it was not meant to be quick. The condemned was dragged to the execution site on a wooden hurdle through the streets, then hanged by the neck until nearly dead, not until dead, then cut down while still conscious. What followed was castration, disembowelment, and the burning of the organs in front of the victim's face, before death finally arrived. The body was then beheaded and divided into 4 parts, which were distributed to different cities as a warning. The first confirmed use of the full method was on Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283, ordered by Edward I. The entire process was public and could last over an hour. The point was not simply to kill. It was to demonstrate that the state could take everything from a person in the correct order, deliberately, in front of a crowd that had been invited to watch. Late medieval and Renaissance. The rat torture, described in accounts connected to the brutal suppression campaigns of the Dutch revolt in the 1560s and 1570s, operated entirely on the logic of inevitability. A container filled with rats was strapped against the victim's body, and heat was applied to the outside. With no other exit available, the rats did what rats do. The entire design was built around a simple offer. The victim could stop the process at any moment by confessing or providing information. The torture was therefore not officially a punishment. It was a conversation that the interrogator had rigged entirely in their favor. Historians debate the frequency and authenticity of some specific accounts, and it is worth noting that certain descriptions may have been sharpened for propaganda purposes by parties opposed to Spanish rule, but the method appears in enough independent sources across the period that dismissing it entirely would require ignoring the pattern entirely. Early modern period. Breaking on the wheel was used extensively across France, Germany, and their colonial territories from the 16th century onward, and it was one of the few execution methods that came with official instructions on duration. The condemned was spread across a large wagon wheel, limbs extended, and an iron bar was brought down methodically on each joint. Ankles, knees, hips, wrists, elbows, shoulders, shattering the bones in sequence. A skilled executioner could extend the process for hours. Families of the condemned would sometimes bribe executioners to deliver early mercy blows to the chest, ending things faster. When no bribe was offered, no mercy was given. France continued the practice until roughly 17, just before the revolution made the guillotine the symbol of rational, efficient state killing. The broken body was typically displayed on the wheel afterward, raised on a pole at a crossroads for days. Germany called it das Rad, the wheel, 19th century. The treadmill introduced to British prisons in 1818 by engineer William Cubitt was not designed to kill anyone, which in some ways made it worse. Prisoners at institutions like Pentonville walked a large paddle wheel for up to 10 hours per day, 6 days a week, climbing the equivalent of a small mountain and arriving exactly nowhere. The wheel powered grain mills in some facilities, but in many it was deliberately connected to nothing at all. The exhaustion was the point, not the output. The damage accumulated over months, destroyed joints, heart stress, and a psychological deterioration that prison reformers of the era began documenting with increasing alarm. It ran alongside the silent system, which prohibited all conversation in human contact, ensuring that the body broke in isolation from any social comfort. Oscar Wilde endured hard labor during his imprisonment from 1895 to 1897, though historians note his specific exposure to the treadmill versus other labor forms requires careful sourcing. Britain abolished the treadmill in 1902. 20th century. The Soviet psikhushka system, formalized under Brezhnev from the 1960s onward, was built on a single devastating idea, that a dissident's belief in their own sanity was itself the evidence of their illness. Sane individuals, writers, intellectuals, military figures like General Petro Grigorenko were committed to psychiatric hospitals under a diagnosis called sluggish schizophrenia, a condition invented specifically for this purpose by Soviet psychiatrists at institutions including the Serbsky Center in Moscow. Once inside, patients were subjected to disorienting drug regimens, isolation, and a continuous clinical insistence that their perception of reality was the symptom. Amnesty International documented the system extensively, and post-1991 Soviet archives confirmed what survivors had been reporting for decades. What separated this from other forms of state punishment was its precision. It did not destroy the body first. It went directly for the self, methodically dismantling the victim's trust in their own mind, and called the process treatment. The minister's unsteady acts. On July 28, 1540, the most powerful man in England after the king himself knelt on the scaffold at Tower Hill. Just weeks earlier, he had been the Earl of Essex, Lord Great Chamberlain, and King Henry VIII's chief minister. Now he was simply a condemned traitor awaiting the executioner's blade. Cromwell had engineered the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and dismantled England's monasteries. He had rewritten laws and destroyed rivals with ruthless efficiency. But when he arranged Henry's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, his enemies seized their chance. The king who had once trusted him completely now signed his death warrant without hesitation. As Cromwell knelt on the rough wooden boards, his neck exposed on the block, witnesses reported he showed little fear. The crowd was large but quiet. Many had come to see the downfall of a man they had feared for years. The appointed executioner, however, was not the Tower's experienced headsman, but a replacement, less skilled, less practiced in the swift mercy of a clean stroke. The axe rose in the air. When it fell, it struck not cleanly but awkwardly, catching Cromwell's skull at an angle. Contemporary accounts describe how the blade failed to sever the neck. Cromwell did not die instantly. He remained conscious, blood pouring from the partial wound, aware of what was happening as pain exploded through his body. The executioner raised the axe again. A second blow fell, still not enough to complete the beheading. Some chroniclers claimed it took a third stroke before Cromwell's head was finally separated from his body. The once powerful minister who had orchestrated so many deaths now experienced his own in prolonged agony. His final moments stretched into an eternity of suffering as the incompetent executioner hacked at his neck. When the head was finally held up to the crowd, it was hardly the clean execution befitting a nobleman. The spectators who had come for justice left having witnessed something far more disturbing. He broke his own neck to escape the worst. On January 31st, 1606, a weakened man was dragged from his cell at the Tower of London to meet his fate. For 3 months, Fawkes had endured brutal torture after being discovered guarding explosives beneath Parliament, the infamous gunpowder plot to assassinate King James I and restore Catholic rule to England. His planned execution was designed not merely to kill, but to deliver maximum suffering as a warning to others. The sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for traitors, and Fawkes knew exactly what awaited him. First, he would be hanged until nearly dead. Then, still conscious, he would be cut down, his removed and his abdomen sliced open. His intestines would be pulled out and burned before his eyes while he remained alive. Finally, his body would be quartered, the pieces displayed across London. A cart carried Fawkes through streets lined with thousands of spectators eager to see the Catholic conspirator punished. When he arrived at the scaffold in Old Palace Yard, Westminster, he climbed weakly to the platform. The noose was placed around his neck. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm, despite knowing the horror that awaited him. But Fawkes had one final act of defiance planned. As the cart was pulled away to begin his hanging, he did not wait passively. According to contemporary accounts, Fawkes suddenly jumped from the ladder with enough force to break his own neck. Some reports suggest he may have climbed higher on the scaffold than permitted, giving himself enough height for a fatal fall. The snap was audible to those standing nearby. In an instant, Fawkes denied his the spectacle they had prepared. His body still swung from the rope, but the man was already gone. The executioner cut him down to begin the disembowelment, only to discover Fawkes had escaped the worst of his punishment. The planned torture would continue on a corpse that could no longer feel pain. The first known drawing and quartering. On October 3, 1283, the last native Prince of Wales stood before a crowd in Shrewsbury, England. Dafydd had led the final Welsh rebellion against King Edward I, continuing to fight even after his brother Llywelyn's death. When captured hiding in a bog with his family, he became the first nobleman sentenced to a punishment designed to make even the bravest men tremble, drawing and quartering. Edward I wanted to make an example of this Welsh rebel. The king personally crafted a sentence unprecedented in its deliberate cruelty, creating what historians now recognize as the first fully documented case of this execution method. Court records show Edward's precise instructions for each stage of suffering Dafydd would endure. As the prisoner was brought to the execution ground, he could see the implements prepared for his destruction: knives, a hanging scaffold, horses, and a fire. Chronicles describe how he was first dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury tied to horses, his body scraping against the rough ground, tearing his skin and filling his wounds with dirt and stones. At the scaffold, executioners placed a noose around his neck. He was hoisted up, but only briefly, not long enough to die. The real torture was yet to begin. Cut down while still conscious, Dafydd was strapped to a table as the executioner approached with a knife. Contemporary accounts describe how his abdomen was cut open while he remained alive and aware. His intestines were pulled out slowly and thrown into a fire burning within his sight. Witnesses reported that Dafydd remained conscious through much of this process, his screams gradually weakening as his body was systematically destroyed. The executioner then cut out his heart, displaying it to the crowd before burning it as well. Only after these torments was he finally beheaded. His body was divided into 4 quarters, each sent to different corners of the realm: York, Winchester, Northampton, and Bristol, while his head was displayed on the Tower of London, a warning to all who would challenge the English crown. The Hanged Man Who Didn't Die, twice. On November 13th, 1290, a 30-year-old Welsh rebel stood beneath a hastily constructed gallows outside Swansea Castle. William Craig, whose actual name was William ap Rhys, but was called Craig, meaning scabby in Welsh, had been captured after leading raids against English settlements. The Norman Lord of Gower, William de Braos, had personally ordered this execution to send a message to other Welsh rebels. The execution was set to be a public spectacle. Craig was marched out alongside another condemned Welshman named Traherne ap Hywel. A significant crowd gathered to witness their punishment. The gallows had been constructed quickly using green wood rather than seasoned timber. As Cragg was led up to the platform, observers noted his calm demeanor despite knowing what awaited him. The noose was placed around his neck. When the signal was given, he was pushed from the platform. His body dropped and jerked at the end of the rope. For several minutes he hung there, his face darkening, his body twitching as he slowly asphyxiated. Witnesses later testified that he urinated and defecated as his body shut down, typical signs of death by hanging. Suddenly, there was a crack. The gallows, poorly built with unseasoned wood, partially collapsed under the weight. Craig fell to the ground, still with the rope around his neck. Guards quickly strung him up again on what remained of the structure. This time they left him hanging until all movement stopped. After being pronounced dead, his body was given to his family for burial. What happened next became the subject of a papal inquiry. According to multiple sworn testimonies, Cragg revived the following day. His body, which had turned black and stiff, began to regain color. He opened his eyes and began to breathe again. Those present were astonished. Some claimed it was a miracle attributed to Thomas de Cantilupe, the former bishop of Hereford. Lord de Braos was unmoved by claims of divine intervention. Cragg was recaptured and again, this time on a properly constructed gallows that did not fail. His second death was permanent. The felon who woke up in the morgue. On December 17th, 1363, a horse thief stood before the crowds at Dublin's main gallows. Trop had been captured after stealing horses from several prominent landowners in County Dublin. In medieval Ireland, horse theft was considered a serious crime, often punishable by death. After a brief trial, Trop was sentenced to until dead. The day was bitterly cold as he was led to the wooden platform. Observers noted that he trembled, though whether from fear or the winter chill was unclear. The hangman worked quickly, placing the noose around Trop's neck and adjusting it to ensure proper placement behind the ear, a position meant to break the neck quickly rather than causing slow strangulation. When the trapdoor opened, Trop fell and jerked violently at the end of the rope. His body swung for the customary amount of time as the crowd watched. After being cut down, a local physician confirmed his death by checking for breath and pulse. Finding none, he was declared dead, and, as was customary for criminals without family claims, his body was taken to St. John's Church to await burial in the morning. What happened during the night became notorious in Dublin for decades. According to church records and witness accounts, the church sexton heard noises in the early hours of the morning. Trop had revived. The hanging had not broken his neck, nor sufficiently cut off his breathing. Instead, the cold weather had slowed his bodily functions, creating a state resembling death. Now conscious and terrified, Trop broke out of the church through a side window. He was disoriented, his neck bruised and damaged from the rope. He managed to stagger only a few hundred yards before collapsing in the street, where he was discovered by the night watch. They immediately recognized the dead man and seized him. The authorities were determined not to repeat their mistake. The following day, Trop was brought back to the gallows. This time they used a new rope and kept his body hanging for twice the usual duration. After being cut down, his corpse was left exposed for a day to ensure death was complete before burial. The fanatic torn apart at the King's Square. On May 27, 1610, a 32-year-old former school teacher and religious fanatic was led to the Place de Grève in Paris. Just 13 days earlier, Ravaillac had stabbed King Henry IV of France to death as the monarch's carriage was caught in traffic. The assassination shocked France. Henry had been a popular king who ended the wars of religion and brought prosperity after decades of civil conflict. Ravaillac claimed he had killed the king because Henry was planning to wage war against the Pope. During his brief trial, he refused to name any co-conspirators, insisting he had acted alone. The Parliament of Paris sentenced him to the most severe punishment in French law, death by dismemberment. On the execution day, a massive crowd gathered at the square. Temporary viewing stands had been constructed to accommodate the spectators, many of whom had paid for the privilege of watching the king's killer die. Ravaillac was brought to the scaffold in a tumbrel cart. Witnesses described him as pale but composed, muttering prayers as he approached his fate. The execution began with torture. Ravaillac hand, which had held the knife, was burned with sulfur. Executioners then used red-hot pincers to tear flesh from his chest, arms, and legs. Molten lead, boiling oil, and burning sulfur were poured into these wounds. Throughout this process, Ravaillac remained conscious, his screams echoing across the square. For the final punishment, 4 horses were harnessed to each of his limbs. The executioners expected his body to separate quickly, but medieval accounts describe how the horses pulled for nearly an hour without success. His joints would not separate. Finally, executioners had to partially sever his shoulders and hip joints with knives before the horses could tear his limbs away. Even after this mutilation, witnesses reported that Ravaillac's facial expressions still showed signs of life. His torso, now without limbs, continued to show movement for several minutes. The crowd, far from showing sympathy, rushed forward to claim pieces of his body and clothing as souvenirs. His dismembered remains were burned to ashes and scattered to the winds, leaving nothing for burial or remembrance. Smithfield's sudden. On June 15, 1381, the leader of England's peasants' revolt arrived at Smithfield just outside London's walls. Tyler had emerged as the charismatic head of a massive uprising that had already stormed the Tower of London, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and burned the Savoy Palace. Now he came to meet the 14-year-old King Richard II, ostensibly to negotiate terms for ending the rebellion. The meeting had been arranged after Tyler's forces took control of much of London. Thousands of rebels waited nearby while Tyler, accompanied by a small group, approached the king and his retinue. Tyler was not a nobleman, but a former soldier with military experience. He rode forward confidently, drinking from a flask of ale as he prepared to present the rebels' demands for lower taxes and an end to serfdom. What happened next was recorded by multiple chroniclers. Tyler approached the king and behaved with unprecedented familiarity. According to witnesses, he called for water to rinse his mouth, then washed his hands in front of the monarch, a shocking breach of protocol. Some accounts claim he even placed his hand on the king's arm, an act that horrified the royal entourage. William Walworth, the mayor of London, immediately objected to Tyler's behavior. Words were exchanged, tensions escalated, and suddenly Walworth drew his sword and stabbed Tyler in the neck. As blood poured from the wound, Tyler tried to remount his horse to escape, but Ralph Standish, one of the king's squires, thrust a sword into his abdomen. Tyler managed to ride about 60 yards before falling from his horse, critically wounded but still alive. The rebel leader lay in the dirt of Smithfield, blood pooling beneath him. As the king's men surrounded him, Tyler remained conscious, aware that his revolution was collapsing around him. Walworth ordered Tyler carried to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but this wasn't an act of mercy. Once there, he was dragged back out and beheaded on the steps. His head was mounted on a pole and paraded through the streets of London before being displayed on London Bridge, the very bridge where days earlier the rebels had placed the heads of their own victims. The slave girl's ritual sacrifice. In the early 10th century, Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan witnessed one of the most methodical ritual killings ever recorded. Traveling along the Volga River, he encountered the Rus people, Viking traders known for their elaborate funeral customs. When a chieftain died, preparations began not just for his burial, but for those who would accompany him into the afterlife. A slave girl volunteered to die with her master. For 6 days, she existed in a state between life and death. She sang and drank alcohol daily, participating in festivities while fully aware of her approaching end. Witnesses described her as appearing joyful, though Ibn Fadlan noted her trembling when led to the ship that would become her funeral pyre. On the 7th day, the girl was dressed in fine garments and adorned with jewelry. The ritual intensified. She was led to a wooden frame beside her dead master's body. 6 men entered the tent and took turns singing her, while others held her arms and legs. The girl screamed as the men invaded her. Then came the most brutal moment. An elderly woman known as the Angel of Death approached with a dagger. 2 men tightened a cord around the girl's neck, while the woman simultaneously stabbed between her ribs. The girl's body convulsed as blood poured from the wound. The strangling continued until she stopped struggling. Her corpse was placed beside her master's on the ship. Attendants piled wood around the vessel and set it ablaze. Within minutes, flames engulfed both bodies. The intense heat prevented anyone from approaching, as flesh and bone were reduced to ash. Ibn Fadlan recorded the scene with horror, noting that the Rus themselves appeared unmoved by the spectacle. To them, it was not a murder, but an honor, a servant accompanying her master into the next life through a ritual of fire and blood. Crucified Roman slave in Britain. In 2017, archaeologists made a disturbing discovery in Fenstanton, Cambridgeshire. Among the skeletal remains dating between AD 130 and 360 was a male who had suffered one of the Roman Empire's most notorious executions. The skeleton, estimated to be 25 to 35 years old at death, bore marks that told a horrifying story of his final moments. This was no ordinary burial. It was the first archaeological evidence of crucifixion ever found in Britain. Examination of the bones revealed thinning in the leg bones, consistent with prolonged shackling. This man had been physically restrained for extended periods before his execution. More disturbing was a nail found driven through his heel bone, unmistakable evidence of crucifixion. The nail had been hammered through from one side, exiting on the other, pinning the victim to the wooden cross. Historians estimate the crucifixion process lasted between hours and days. The victim was first scourged with a multi-tailed whip embedded with bone and metal. This alone could tear flesh from bone, causing extreme blood loss and exposing internal organs. In his weakened state, he was forced forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site. Once nailed to the cross, death came slowly. With arms stretched outward and upward, the chest muscles became increasingly paralyzed. Each breath required him to push up on his nailed feet, causing excruciating pain. Gradually, carbon dioxide built up in his bloodstream. He alternated between asphyxiation and searing pain for hours. The cause of death was likely a combination of shock, dehydration, and asphyxiation. His lungs slowly filled with fluid as his heart struggled to pump. Consciousness remained until near the end, forcing him to experience every moment of his execution. Despite this cruel death, his body was buried formally in a cemetery alongside other individuals, suggesting some measure of dignity was afforded him in death that he had not received in life. Impalement of slave Titus. In September 1714, in the colonial Caribbean, a slave named Titus faced one of history's most agonizing executions. Court records show Titus had been accused of plotting rebellion against his master. The colonial court condemned him to a punishment designed not just to kill, but to serve as a terrifying example to others: impalement. On the morning of his execution, Titus was led to the town square where a sharpened wooden stake had been secured vertically in the ground. Guards forced him to lie on his back as the stake's point was positioned at the base of his spine. With calculating precision, they pushed his body down onto the stake. The wood penetrated his body, forcing its way through his internal organs. The executioner's skill was horrific yet deliberate. They guided the stake carefully to avoid piercing vital organs that would cause immediate death. Instead, the wood passed alongside major blood vessels and organs, ensuring maximum suffering without quick release. When the stake emerged from his upper chest, Titus was lifted upright, the weight of his body driving the stake deeper. Witnesses recorded their shock as Titus remained conscious after the impalement. Blood ran down the stake as he hung suspended above the ground. His breathing became shallow and labored as his lungs struggled against the wooden intrusion. Despite catastrophic internal damage, death did not come quickly. For approximately 48 hours, Titus lingered in this state. During this time, court records note that he was offered arak, a strong alcoholic drink. Astonishingly, he consumed it, remarking that since he was stuck fast on the stake, there was no fear of his falling. His words revealed a horrifying lucidity despite his condition. After Titus finally succumbed to his wounds, executioners decapitated his corpse and severed his right hand. These body parts were mounted on poles outside his master's property, a gruesome warning to others who might consider similar acts of defiance. Sichar's severed slave. In the late 6th century, in the Loire Valley of Merovingian Gaul, a slave belonging to a nobleman named Sichar experienced one of the most brutal deaths recorded by Gregory of Tours. The slave, whose name was not preserved in historical records, had failed to complete assigned tasks to his master's satisfaction. What followed was a punishment that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to violence. Sichar began by beating the slave savagely, striking repeatedly with a wooden staff until the man's skin split open. Blood streamed from multiple wounds as the beating continued without mercy. In desperation, the slave grabbed Sichar's sword from its scabbard. This act of self-defense would seal his fate. Though the slave did not strike his master, the mere act of touching the weapon was deemed an unforgivable transgression. Sichar called for his allies, who quickly seized the bleeding man. They dragged him to a nearby tree where they had prepared tools for his punishment. The slave struggled, but weakened from the beating, could not resist the multiple hands restraining him. First, they severed his right hand, the one that had grasped the sword, using a sharp axe. The blade cut through flesh, tendon, and bone. The slave screamed as blood pulsed from the stump. Still conscious, he watched as they positioned his left hand on a wooden block. The axe fell again. Both feet followed in the same methodical manner. Each amputation was performed slowly, with deliberate cuts that prolonged the slave's awareness of his dismemberment. His screams gradually weakened as blood loss accelerated. Throughout the process, witnesses reported that Sichar watched impassively, ensuring the punishment was carried out completely. With the slave still alive, though barely conscious, they hoisted his mutilated body onto a hastily constructed gibbet. A rope around his neck tightened as they let his weight drop. His final moments were spent hanging, unable even to grasp at the rope with his severed limbs as he slowly suffocated. Rauching's condemned slave. In 6th century Merovingian France, Duke Rauching was known for his exceptional cruelty toward his slave. Gregory of Tours recorded one incident that stood out for its calculated psychological torment and slow execution. Two young slaves, a man and woman who worked in Rauching's household, had fallen in love and fled together, hoping to be married. When captured and returned to their master, they sought sanctuary in a local church. A priest intervened on their behalf, extracting a promise from Rauching that he would not separate the couple. Rauching agreed but added ominously, "I will ensure they remain together eternally." The slaves were returned to his estate. believing they had secured mercy through the church's intercession. Rauching's first act of cruelty came at dinner that same evening. He ordered the male slave to hold a candle between his bare legs. As the wax melted, it scorched the slave's flesh. When the pain became unbearable and the slave attempted to move, Rauching threatened immediate execution. The slave remained still, as his skin blistered and charred, the scent of burning flesh filling the dining hall while Rauching and his guests continued eating. The following morning, Rauching ordered a coffin prepared. The two slaves watched in growing horror as servants dug a grave 7 feet deep. Rauching then had the couple seized. They struggled as guards forced them into the wooden box together. The woman screamed, realizing Rauching's true intent behind his promise not to separate. Once inside, Rauching ordered the lid nailed shut. The couple's muffled pleas could be heard from within as the coffin was lowered into the ground. "Now you shall be united forever," Rauching announced as servants began shoveling dirt onto the coffin. The couple's cries grew fainter as soil piled above them. Inside the buried coffin, air quickly depleted. The couple held each other in the darkness, gasping for breath as oxygen dwindled. Death came slowly through suffocation, their bodies found still embracing when the grave was later excavated at the priest's insistence. The beheaded companion. In a 10th century Viking burial site in Stengade, Denmark, archaeologists uncovered a grave containing 2 skeletons, one of a high-status warrior surrounded by weapons and valuable grave goods, the other of a young male whose remains told a disturbing story. The secondary skeleton showed evidence of binding at the wrists and ankle. More telling was the position of the skull, separated from the body and placed at the feet of the primary burial. This was not a natural death, but a deliberate human sacrifice. The secondary individual was likely a thrall, a slave owned by the Viking warrior. Analysis of the bones revealed the slave was approximately 16 to 20 years old and had suffered periods of malnutrition throughout his short life. Cut marks on the cervical vertebrae indicated a methodical decapitation performed with a sharp blade, likely a sword or specialized knife. The sacrifice would have been conducted as part of the funeral ritual. As the warrior's body was prepared for burial, the slave was selected to accompany his master into the afterlife. The young man would have been aware of his impending death for either hours or possibly days beforehand. Unlike some ritualized deaths where intoxicants might dull the senses, evidence suggests the slave remained fully conscious during the procedure. The execution was performed with the slave positioned on his knees. His hands were bound behind his back with rope or leather straps, preventing any resistance. A wooden block was placed beneath his neck. The executioner, likely an experienced warrior, would have stood to one side, calculating the precise angle needed for a clean cut. The first strike severed the major blood vessels of the neck, causing immediate and catastrophic blood loss. The slave would have remained conscious for approximately 15 to 30 seconds, as blood pressure to the brain plummeted. Multiple subsequent blows were required to completely separate the head from the body, as evidenced by several distinct cut marks on the vertebrae. Once decapitated, the slave's body was arranged in the grave beside his master, his severed head placed at the foot of the burial, a servant in death as he had been in life. Amputated hands and feet. Between the 13th and 15th centuries in Estremoz, southern Portugal, archaeologists uncovered evidence of one of history's most methodical punishments. At the edge of a medieval necropolis, far from the main burial area, lay 3 male skeletons side by side. All were young, estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old. Each skeleton displayed the same horrific mutilation. Their hands and feet had been systematically amputated. Forensic analysis revealed these were not battlefield injuries or post-mortem mutilation. The cut marks on the bones showed clean, deliberate severances made with sharp implements, likely axes or cleavers. More disturbing was evidence of bone healing at the amputation sites, indicating the victims lived for days after the initial mutilation. Historical records from the period describe this punishment being reserved for slaves who had attempted escape multiple times. The process began in public, designed to serve as a warning to others. The victims were secured to wooden tables or benches, their limbs extended and immobilized. The executioner would start with the feet. A precise blow separated each foot at the ankle. Blood vessels were sometimes cauterized with hot irons to prevent immediate death from blood loss. Each victim remained conscious, experiencing the full pain of the procedure. Next came the hands, severed at the wrists with similar precision. Without proper medical care, infection set in quickly. Fever, delirium, and septic shock followed within days. The victims experienced extreme thirst as their bodies fought systemic infection. Pain would have been constant and severe, unrelieved by any medication. Death, when it finally came after approximately 3 to 5 days, resulted from septicemia rather than blood loss. The deliberate placement of these bodies at the cemetery's edge, separate from other burials, showed that even in death, these individuals were considered outcasts. Their punishment continued symbolically, denied the dignity of proper burial among the community, and marked by their mutilations as transgressors even in the afterlife. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.